Thanks everyone for coming about to this discussion of debt and deficits in 2025 and beyond. I want to thank our panelists for coming. We have Jessica Riedl from the Manhattan Institute. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Riedl. It's fine.
Riedl.
I've heard worse.
Yeah. Ernie Tedeschi from the Budget Lab at Yale. And Daniel Hornung, who until just recently was at the National Economic Council. So very much appreciate them taking the time. I have a couple of questions kind of about where we are, how we got here, what does this mean, should we care, etc. And then we'll also hopefully open it up to questions for a little bit. So I want to start with Jessica. Would you mind just talking a little bit about what the debt and deficit picture looks like at the moment? And then Ernie, if you could talk a little bit about kind of how we got here.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Martha. Thank you all for coming out. So the budget deficit right now is $1.8 trillion last year, which is in nominal dollars triple what it was when Trump took office in 2017, which one would hope would lead to a different set of fiscal policies than we had in 2018. Right now, again, it's about 5% of GDP, and the danger is if you use a current policy baseline, which is Washington nerdery for, let's assume the same tax policies and spending policies are projected forward, the tax cuts are extended, you have a deficit going to $3.6 trillion a decade from now, and that's the low interest rate scenario. That's the scenario that assumes interest rates stay at about 3.5% on the federal debt. If interest rates go up a point, add $500 billion. You're looking at a $4 trillion deficit a decade from now, just to consider current policies. In a rational world, this would cause a revisiting of our fiscal policy approach, but we're not in a rational world.
Okay. What a handoff. Definitely agree with that. How we got here. So, story that I like to tell about how we got here. I like to start the story in 2000, which I think is convenient because 2001 is the last time that we ran a budget surplus in the United States. So back in 2001, the Congressional Budget Office, which is the nonpartisan budget scorekeeper in the United States, they projected surpluses as far as the eye could see. And as a matter of fact, they projected that the United States was going to pay off all of its debt within the decade. Now, in reality, we weren't going to retire all U.S. treasuries because that would cause a collapse of the global financial system. But we probably would have accumulated savings more than enough to offset whatever outstanding treasuries that there were at the time. This was such a concern that the Fed chair at the time, Alan Greenspan, was legitimately thinking about what are the implications of paying off America's debt. Those were the types of problems that economists were thinking about at the time. Several things changed from 2000 to 2001. One thing to keep in mind is that even from the perspective of 2001, we knew that there was this demographic wave coming. The population was getting older, and that was going to put pressure on our mandatory spending programs, Social Security and Medicare. Second thing, we did not anticipate that there were going to be two very expensive wars coming over the next decade. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. People, I heard a comment the other day, in the grapevine, how did we rack up all of this debt without a war? We did have, we had two wars that were extremely expensive over the last 25 years. Let's not forget that. The other thing is that we had 3 recessions after 2000, 2 of which were among the deepest in American history, the 2008 recession and the pandemic. And let's remember that the policy space has evolved to the point where the federal government reacts much more concertedly in reaction to recessions than it has in the past. Now that's a good thing, but it does mean that after recessions, debt goes up by a lot more than it has in past business cycles. The last thing that happened was that there were several rounds of tax cuts. So 2001, 2003, 2017, and there were a series of extensions for all of those tax cuts. And those extensions happened under administrations from both parties. And the way I like to think about it is sort of like the Titanic. Like, we had enough fiscal space in 2000 where it probably could have survived any one of those shocks, but like all of those shocks together, there was not enough fiscal space for all of that. And so as a result now, we're facing an unsustainable fiscal trajectory where debt to GDP is going to continue to go up.
So, all of that sounds very scary and like a lot. One thing that I think people often say at this point is like, should I care, right? So people have been saying, oh no, debt and deficits, this is a problem, for quite some time. And they keep saying it's going to be a problem and it keeps not being a problem. And, people will sometimes point to Japan, which has an incredibly high debt to GDP ratio. And so far that has been okay for Japan. And so I'm wondering if you all can talk about how you think about the consequences or not consequences of rising debt and deficits. So Daniel, let's start with you and then kind of go down the road.
So I think the answer is we should care. And I also think we probably should not be alarmed in a kind of catastrophic way sitting where we are now. If you look at kind of our current trajectory where, right now debt to GDP is around 100% of GDP, it's going to rise over the next decade to almost 120, and that's assuming that the tax cuts expire, which they will not. If they are extended, unpaid for, they rise to more than 130% of GDP. And what you worry about over a kind of medium term is that interest rates continue to slowly rise. That starts to crowd out some of the important investments that you would want the private sector to be making in kind of productivity enhancing areas. It starts also to put pressure on other areas of government spending such that all of a sudden it's harder to make the decisions to do things like invest in education or invest in infrastructure, because instead you're servicing the debt with so much of the revenue that you're bringing in. So I think it's a challenge that whether you're progressive or conservative or whatever, there's a lot of reason to think about addressing. I think that how you address it matters, though. So one of the reasons that the growing fiscal problems we have, I think, are really such a problem are that you worry that over time, one, it starts to be difficult for the government to do things that help low and middle income people. And you worry that there's a bigger risk of a large fiscal adjustment that will be borne disproportionately by vulnerable people in the bottom and the middle of the income distribution. So, you wouldn't want, where I sit, to engage in very rapid deficit reduction that would have a really negative impact on middle and low income people right now, in hopes of protecting low and middle income people in the future. That said, you would think differently about a set of fiscal modifications that would be borne more kind of proportionally across the income distribution, or really born at the top of the income distribution. So I think that, deficits and debt do matter, probably not a crisis as we sit here today, but one that will get harder and harder to address as time goes on if we don't take some action.
Ernie.
So I want to pick up on what Daniel said about this not being a crisis. I completely agree. I think that we've been talking about the consequences of debt, U.S. debt in particular, all wrong. Not Daniel and Jessica who talk about debt perfectly, but just in general, we've been talking about it all wrong. Because I think that we've been talking about U.S. debt in the financial press and the fiscal press so much like the United States is an emerging market economy. where the risk is primarily in the short run. And we need to be extremely sober about what the risks are with US debts, right? The United States, at the end of the day, issues government securities that are the most liquid in the world, that are denominated in what is, for the time being, the world's reserve currency. So there is some short-run risk. A lot of that is political risk that involves debt ceiling brinksmanship. But I think primarily most of the risk is in the long run with US debt. It's sort of akin to, like a smoker in his late 30s being worried that he's going to drop dead tomorrow. Like, yes, that is a possibility, but that's probably the wrong weight about where to worry about, the health risks involved, right? So, we at Budget Lab are releasing a report either today or tomorrow that tries to reframe the way that we talk about the risks around debt. So, there's this standard finding in the literature, in the economic literature, that for every 1 percentage point of debt that you add to, to federal debt, that it increases interest rates by 2 basis points. That's a pretty standard finding in the economic literature. So what we've done is we've translated that into cost of living for households over both the short run and the long run. So some of the things that we found is that if you permanently increase the deficit by 1% of GDP over time, which just so happens to be roughly about what the effect of permanently extending the TCJA would be if you didn't pay for it. That has 2 effects on inflationary pressure. One, in the very short run, it has a classic Keynesian effect where it increases aggregate demand. We saw very recently in the pandemic how that has an effect on inflationary pressure. In the long run, it has a supply side effect, right, where it crowds out investment, as Daniel was saying, and that can make inflation volatility higher and increase the risk of inflation over time. So if the Fed doesn't react, that can increase inflationary pressure to the tune of the equivalent of between $300 to $1,200 per household over the first 5 years. That's the way to think about the equivalent inflationary effect per household, putting aside whatever benefits you get from the policy that increased the debt in the first place. Now, we live in a country where thankfully we do have a Federal Reserve, and they are going to try to neutralize any inflationary effect. But that doesn't get you out of the trade-off, right? Because now, instead of the cost of living increase coming from price pressure, it's coming from higher interest rates. So that means that whatever you would have gotten on the price side, now you're seeing in things like mortgages and car loans and, small business loans. So in our report, we converted, what that interest rate effect would be in terms of typical mortgages. So if you took today's typical house, today's typical, mortgage rate, and you look 5 years down the line as a result of this 1% of GDP deficit shock, that would translate to $600 to $1,200 of increased mortgage interest for the typical mortgage after 5 years, and about $2,500 after 30 years as a result of this shock. And again, that's just the gross, negative effect of this interest rate shock. If you looked at the typical increase in small business loan interest, it would be $1,000 extra in the first 5 years, and about $3,500 after 30 years. Those are the concrete reasons, I think, why households need to be concerned about growing debt over time. Doesn't mean that there aren't policies that make it worth that trade-off, especially in recessions. It might very well be worth it to accept those trade-offs over time. But I think that households need to be aware that that is the trade-off that they're looking at.
Jessica, are debt and deficits a crisis?
Not yet. But I think
I thought you were being so polite.
I am going to take a little more of the sky is falling approach. Look, we're not facing a debt crisis now. The economy is not going to crash at 100% of GDP debt or 120% or 130%. For the next 10 years, it's not going to happen. The danger is we're setting ourselves up for numbers that over 20 or 30 years can become cataclysmic. So CBO's long-term baseline assumes that under current law, the debt goes to 166% of GDP in 30 years. But if you do current policy, We're going to extend the tax cuts. We're going to take out some odd assumptions about discretionary spending plummeted. The debt goes to 241% of GDP in 30 years. And again, this is just the baseline before any politicians have done anything beyond extend current policies. Now, even that assumption assumes that the interest rate on the debt never exceeds 3.8% ever again. If interest rates go up a point, now you're looking at a debt of about 290% of GDP in 30 years. The economic word for that is bad. At that point, interest on the debt would be about 15 to 18% of GDP, which is to say 80 to 100% of all tax revenues would just go to paying interest on that debt. Now, that's the time bomb here. We know how much Social Security is going to cost. We have a pretty good grip on how much Medicare is going to cost. But the interest, when you have a debt this big, you're really betting the future of the economy on the hope that interest rates stay below 4% forever. They have to, or else you're crushed. Interest, 2 years ago, surpassed Medicaid. Last year, it surpassed defense. This year, interest is surpassing Medicare. It is now going to be the second biggest item in the budget after Social Security, which will be surpassed in 17 years to become the biggest item in the budget. That's what worries me. And again, as for rising interest rates, a 1% increase in interest rates over 30 years compared to the CBO baseline would cost us nearly as much as adding a second Defense Department over 30 years. That's per point. This is what worries me. When I look at the financial markets, and I am very nervous discussing this next to this guy because he knows more about financial markets and debt than I will ever know. Right now, we have a debt of about 30 trillion. The current policy baseline is that the debt goes to 200 trillion over 30 years. Now, the economy is going to get bigger. Inflation is going to make that a little smaller. These are nominal dollars. I get that. Adjust them somewhat for that. But how easy is it going to be to borrow $200 trillion in 30 years for government spending? China and Japan only hold $1 trillion of our debt, and they've been somewhat deleveraging, and they don't even have the capacity to take, they're not going to have the capacity to take on a significant share of 200 trillion. Now, there's other countries that lend us money. I wouldn't count on them to take on a huge share of it. It's too big. So you're left with the fact that the vast majority of $200 trillion is going to have to come from domestic investors, mutual funds, insurance, state governments. That's going to be a heavy lift at a 3.5% interest rate. That's what worries me. And it doesn't just worry me. A year and a half ago, Penn Wharton wrote a report on the debt projections and the macro economy, and their model collapses after about 15 or 20 years. They can't project a functioning economy at current debt trends. Maybe they're being a little overly pessimistic, but I look at where we are now. Like Ernie says, we're smoking the cigarettes now. We're not going to drop dead now. But if we don't quit, if we keep smoking at the rate we're smoking, it's going to be really bad in a couple of decades. And I would rather start adjusting in slower reforms now than drastic reforms later.
I will take this moment to briefly pitch that Budget Lab's chief economist, Danny Yegan, and Alan Auerbach at Berkeley have a paper on what kind of historical adjustments in the deficit have looked like and how sizable those sort of can be. And, the sort of story there is more than, say, 2.5% twice in a decade is pretty hard to do. So, see. Each of you has at some point mentioned the current tax debate in Congress. Daniel, I'm wondering if you can talk about how that debate is or is not interacting, or I shouldn't say interacting, taking into account where we are from a deficit debt perspective. And is that a good idea?
Well, if you just read the kind of Politico type coverage of the tax debate and read the things that members say coming out of the Ways and Means markup or whatever, it's just fundamentally disconnected from the conversation we're having here. It's as if we're on like, I know we're in different, we're a few hundred miles away or whatever, but as if we're on totally different planets. If you look at kind of the original, just the extension of the TCJA and then the other proposals that President Trump, has mentioned in the State of the Union address or on the campaign. I mean, I won't do the full estimates of what those are. I think, others have put out, $10 trillion, and the pay-fors that they've discussed and that are in the House budget resolution, in addition to really being born almost entirely in the bottom of the income distribution, which I think is the exact wrong way to do deficit reduction. They are just not sufficient to pay for anything like the magnitude of the tax cuts that are being discussed. And so, I would have hoped maybe overly optimistically that there could have been a discussion about, to start with, how you think about extending the TCJA, not just extending everything in it. And I think, part of that would come down to looking at provisions that I think broadly people agree are not, don't contribute a lot to economic growth and disproportionately benefit the highest income households on the individual side. So things like the top rate, things like the pass-through deduction for certain portions of the income distribution. There were some things that even I will acknowledge in the TCJA that likely did contribute to growth. We know that things like accelerated, when you do things like bonus depreciation and you allow businesses to write off their investments more quickly, that does incentivize long-term investment. But instead what we've had is just a conversation that says, well, we have to extend the whole thing and we have to add a whole other set of things on top of it. And we're going to put forward pay-fors that don't come close to paying for what we're proposing. And on top of it, those pay-fors are going to really harm low-income people. And so I think it's kind of been the worst of all worlds, and maybe that's an understatement.
Ernie, Jessica.
I mean, I'll say, as the token fiscal conservative in the room, even I'm scared of extending the tax cuts in terms of the cost. And actually, it's kind of interesting. I work in Washington. I'm kind of very plugged into the conservative think tank movement. And one of the interesting things you'll find is even the conservative think tankers are saying don't extend the tax cuts without pay-fors. This is very different than it used to be 10, 20 years ago. Even Tax Foundation, even AEI, even Cato are saying you have to pay for this because, again, when Trump took office in 2017, the deficit was $600 billion. Now it's $1.8 trillion. You have to revisit your approach in that situation. And the House budget is unserious. It's $4.5 trillion in 10-year tax cuts with a bunch of gimmicks to pay for it that aren't gonna really play out. And so I would like to see this paid for. I don't think it's gonna happen. I think some of the pay-fors that we've seen in the press look bad. I don't think they're gonna pass. I think we're just gonna end the year with $4 trillion in tax cut extensions, and that's that.
I think from a financial markets perspective, I think this is the biggest bond vigilante moment potentially that we've had since the 1990s. And I think that's in part because this is really the first full employment increase in the deficit that we've had since the original TCJA in 2017, and debt was much lower back in TCJA, and the 10-year was much lower when the TCJA passed in 2017. So I think it was less concerning to markets back, originally in 2017. Now when deficits increase in the middle of recessions, interest rates are naturally low, and markets are, not thinking about fiscal space and crowding out at that point in time. They're thinking about short run demand recovery. But the moment that we're at now just really feels like a crossroads in a way that it hasn't in other times. And so I think that the outcome of this debate in Congress feels like it's going to set, I don't know, the tone or the trajectory for our fiscal path in a lot of ways over the next 10 years. And I don't know, for me, I think that's why the stakes feel higher in this debate than they have in a lot of other recent fiscal debates that we've had.
So I hear all of you, and that sounds fine. But I've seen Elon Musk with his chainsaw, and my understanding is that this will not be a problem because DOGE is going to cut the federal budget. So Jessica, would you mind discussing the ways in which DOGE is going to save us from what you all have been talking about here?
Every morning, I wake up resolved to not make fun of DOGE on Twitter. And every day I fail.
On X, yes, please continue.
Every day I fail.
Absolutely not.
I cannot stop making fun of DOGE. I've actually spent much of my last 6 weeks talking to reporters and giving speeches on DOGE. It's a comedy of errors. Musk originally promised $2 trillion in savings in 1 year, which is essentially mathematically impossible without going into Social Security, Medicare, defense, veterans, and everything else Trump doesn't want to touch. Then they put up a website that promised that said we've already cut $55 billion, except they hadn't. They only listed $16 billion, of which $8 billion was a typo. Confusing $8 billion and $8 million. They were yes
Amongst us.
I mean, who amongst us hasn't confused 8 billion with 8 million, 8 billion with 8 million? They triple counted the same savings. They took credit for savings from a contract that was canceled in 2005. They made all sorts of errors, and ultimately they had saved $2 billion so far. And that's 1/35 of 1% of the federal budget. Really, even the $2 billion may not happen because I can say in a law school here that impoundment is unconstitutional, which means that if they save money, they have to reprogram it elsewhere according to the congressional appropriation and authorization laws. So at this point, DOGE is essentially propaganda. If you look at what they're going after, DEI contracts, political pro-subscriptions, foreign aid, government employees, none of this is going to save much money. This stuff in the context of our deficit is budget dust. But what it does do is it really excites the MAGA base. And that's what they're going for. They're going for the cultural totems. It is not a serious effort to save money. And in fact, I would argue it's destructive because it's painting the perception that we can balance the budget by just getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, which makes it harder to do the hard stuff. And it's also taking away all the attention and oxygen from a Congress that's about to extend the tax cuts by $4.5 trillion. While everyone else is talking about DOGE cutting $2 billion, wow, what budget cutters? Congress is actually blowing up the deficit. So it's a giant distraction.
So to bring these last 2 points together, I think there's a really interesting it will be interesting to see how the next several months play out. I agree that, DOGE has just entirely become propaganda and political theater. And, if you want to give credit, I guess, like effective political theater to some degree. And so I think there's a question if where we're headed to is the end of the year, temporary extension of the tax cuts unpaid for, let's say 8 years, $4 trillion, I'm just making this 8 years, $4 trillion, very little pay-fors, and a continued kind of drumbeat of propaganda on DOGE. What does the market say about that? I mean, I don't know. I'm curious for your views, Ernie. I think that there's a world in which markets and market participants continue to be very bullish on what the tax cuts mean for the economy. I've been a little bit confused about that, given that, there shouldn't actually be much economic effect of just extending current policy. But that isn't kind of the conversation in markets right now. Obviously, markets are very freaked out by the tariffs and everything else going on. We've seen that in the stock market and treasuries over the last few weeks. But it will be interesting. I mean, if you could also see a world in which the market somewhat brushes this aside and says, well, like, we're fine right now, and the next big fiscal forcing mechanism will be the trust funds in the 2030s, and we'll just continue to see how everything goes until then. I think that that would be an incorrect conclusion from the standpoint of a policymaker, but markets have different incentives.
I will say markets are eating up anything they can get on Doge analysis right now. So like Martha and I wrote a very quick jobs day preview, that linked it to Doge. Like, what was that? Maybe 500 words. And like, I have not seen, we've gotten so many hits on that thing. It's amazing. Which I think is a way of saying that like markets are extremely interested in how Doge is going to play out economically, maybe to a second tier fiscally. And at some point, they're going to get the answer to this because, I mean, unless Treasury starts messing with the payments data, which they could, because Doge is getting into the payments data. But for the moment, we actually have, daily Treasury payments data that we can use to infer what government spending is. We're going to have an answer on how government spending is changing over time, like at the, departmental level, at the agency level. And so we can answer the question objectively, eventually, how much have we saved at USAID? How much have we saved at the State Department? At all these other agencies? And the propaganda will eventually have to be backed up by hard numbers. And I think that there's too much interest in markets for them not to eventually get to an answer here. Once they get an answer, particularly among bond traders who actually have like a vested pecuniary interest in knowing the answer to this question, right? Like, because they have money where their mouth is in terms of the investment. Once they see that the savings here are very small, I think that interest rates will act accordingly if they haven't already, sort of depriced whatever they had in terms of Doge. The other thing I'll say, going back to what Jessica was talking about was put aside, the mistakes that Doge has made, put aside, and this is a risk saying this at Yale Law School, put aside the legality of what they're doing, just get to the point that like, if you think that Doge's mission is to reduce the deficit, and I'm not even sure that's supposed to be their mission. I thought their mission was supposed to be government efficiency, which is something slightly different than reducing the deficit. A noble mission, by the way. It's a good mission. For those of you who have worked in government, like we can all think of all sorts of ways to make the government efficient. That's it's a great thing to do. But that's different than saving money necessarily. It's not a totally perfect, Venn overlap. There's the fact that what they are focusing on, discretionary contracts, government salaries, that is not where the problem is over the next 10 years. It is a combination of certain mandatory programs and our lack of revenues to pay for them, right? It is a combination of those two things. And so even if they save $10, $20 billion, $50 billion, that is not where the growth in federal spending is going to be, in non-interest federal spending is going to be over the next 10 years. And so in some ways, they're just spinning their wheels in terms of the actual fiscal problem.
Far be it from me to disagree with Jessica, but I'm going to disagree with Jessica on
I'm used to
something,
it.
which is that you said that, even taking whatever, that you could see maybe like $2 billion in savings from Doge, and that, is very, very small. I do want to point out there are costs to Doge as well, right? So, you have many government employees who are being paid to not work right now.
Yeah.
That is expensive. You have other government employees who have been fired, legally or not, and then brought back. That is expensive, because then you're now paying them for the time that they were fired. We've been told that those people have been given admin leave for the time that they were fired. You have, many people in the federal government who are not able to fully focus on their jobs because they are dealing with the doge of it all, and so they're not providing the services that people are looking for. You have the Justice Department, who is now spending a lot of time defending doge cuts rather than doing other Justice Department work. And so it is also really important to think about what government could be doing and what government, is spending money on in order to do doge in a way that I think is really important to acknowledge here. We've gotten multiple questions.
Can I just have,
Yes.
just super quickly on that, just because I can't help myself.
Go for it.
Just two very quick things on Doge in addition to kind of Ernie's point about efficiency and what you were saying, Martha. I mean, the IRS is an example of a place where you couldn't think of a more backward approach to government efficiency. Their approach has been to try to slash the workforce at the IRS, among other things, which will bring in less tax revenue and worsen our fiscal outlook, and from an efficiency standpoint, make it harder to get your phone call answered and your mail returned and all of the like. And then you just look at the places across government and housing and other places where if you wanted to do the hard work of making processes more efficient to make it, for example, faster for loans to be underwritten, that would be a really noble thing to do. But instead, you see at a place like the Federal Housing Administration where they've tried to cut that staff as well. What's going to happen is people who are trying to get loans to build housing and help solve our housing crisis in the country, their loans will not get underwritten quickly. Instead, it will take months and years and deals just won't happen.
I should take this moment to plug the analysis the Budget Lab has done in the past on how cutting funds to the IRS is fiscally not a great idea. So we've gotten a couple of questions about recession, which has been an increasing topic of conversation over the last, 24 or 48 hours. Do you all think that there's going to be a shift in rhetoric around the tax cuts, that we need to pass the tax cuts in order to stimulate the economy that is falling into recession? And do you agree with that rhetorical argument?
Yes. So
You agree with the rhetorical argument, or you think the rhetorical argument's gonna be made?
sorry, I agree that the rhetorical argument is going to be made. This is exactly what happened in 2001, by the way. So the EGTRA, whichever one was in 2001, EGTRA, I think, was initially proposed, and then the 2001 recession happened, and then sort of it was retconned into being sort of stimulus for the economy back then, and justified in that way. I think that they will use the same sort of rhetorical playbook with the extension, which makes less sense than it did with EGTRA, because EGTRA was something new in 2001, whereas this is just an extension, for the most part, of things that already pre-exist. So I guess you could make the case that this is not the time to increase taxes in the economy, so that's a fair argument to make. But in terms of net new fiscal impulse for the economy, just extending what we already have is not going to add anything relative to recent history in the economy. In terms of like an actual recession, I'll point to recent analysis that the Budget Lab has done on tariffs and what effect that has on GDP. Now, I know that it's like really hard to track what tariffs are or are not on at any given time. But under the assumption that like right now, the China and Mexico tariffs are not in place, that they are mostly accepted because of the USMCA exceptions, which is not, it's much more complex than that, but it's not entirely true. The China tariffs only have an effect on short-run GDP of about 0.1 to 0.2%. And even if you double that, it's 0.2 to 0.4%. So if you think that we're running at a trend of 2% GDP growth in 2025, you shave off generously maybe half a point of that because of, expectations, et cetera. China tariffs alone that we've had so far probably aren't enough to pull us into a recession. Now, there's a giant asterisk with that, right? Number one, we may get more China tariffs on top of the 20% we already have. Number two, the uncertainty that's coming with putting tariffs on and off may have even bigger effects that we're just not able to model because that is not a thing that we are confident modeling with economic models. And thirdly, of course, there just are all sorts of tariffs that may be around the corner that we just don't know about yet. EU tariffs, reciprocal tariffs, other things that could build on top of one another. And then non-tariff shocks like immigration, other things that could layer on top of that for the year. That's all of which is to say that I don't think that we have quite built to a recessionary shock yet, but I do think we have a substantial headwind already to growth that we need to worry about.
Daniel, should we extend the TCJA to fight the trade recession?
I mean, there would be just a tremendous, the one difference from the early 2000s experience is George Bush didn't cause that recession. And
Very good point.
Come to Yale Law School and defend George Bush is a rare thing. But I mean, the irony of Donald Trump single-handedly causing this recession, which you can rarely say that a president causes a recession. We usually overstate the degree to which a president has any control over the macroeconomy. But I think if we had a recession coming out of this experience, which, I agree with Ernie, certainly mechanically, the tariffs under discussion now shouldn't be enough to give us, prolonged negative growth. But if that happened because the uncertainty and the threat of additional tariffs just really put a damper on consumer and business sentiment that then just flowed through the economy, it really would be a self-induced crisis from this president and from the administration, and then for them to turn around and say the thing that we must do is extend our tax policy without paying for it to cure the recession that we've caused would be really just fantastical. And I just add that if you were to think about the kind of policy that you'd want to employ in the event of a downturn and a recession, an extension of current policy that large share of the economic benefits flow to high-income households would be one of the kind of lowest down on the list things you'd consider.
I want to jump in.
With cuts to SNAP and Medicaid that have kind of automatic stabilizing function to some degree.
I want to get to Jessica as well, but I just want to jump in to make one point here, which is one of the issues that we are dealing with in the policy mix right now is that a lot of the things that are being talked about or implemented are stagflationary, right? So deportations, assuming they really pick up, we've already seen some reports of basically a chilling effect on immigrants currently in the country from a work perspective. Tariffs, a bunch of other things, those are stagflationary. Figuring out the right policy mix in a stagflationary context is hard because, normally the economy slows down, inflation also comes down. And so you want to put more money into the economy to spur it up again, and rising prices is part of that. If you have a slowing economy and also rising inflation, that's actually a very hard thing to manage. And I think that that's also something to keep in mind, is that this wouldn't necessarily be a recession where, and I want to be clear here, we're sort of talking here as if a recession is happening, and I don't think that that's at all determined. But this is a type of recession that is much more complicated to deal with if it happens, and it happens in a stagflationary way, than the recessions that we are quote unquote used to seeing in recent decades. Jessica, now I will kick it over to you.
Oh, that's great. I agree with all of that. And just to broaden it out to the economic growth outlook, I work a lot with congressional Republicans. About a month ago, I briefed the entire Republican Budget Committee on the outlook. And the point I kept getting back from each Republican, from Chairman Arrington on down, was no, economic growth is going to solve this. We're going to grow at 3% permanently starting now, and that's going to bring in all this money. And the danger here, and all of you each alluded to parts of this, is how hard it's going to be in the current policy environment for us to grow in a healthy way. And the main thing is, as you all know, economic growth is the product of the growth of the labor force and the growth of productivity. Well, as for the labor force, the U.S. population is set to basically level off in about a decade for the rest of the century. In fact, within a decade, deaths will start outnumbering births, which means immigration will be the only thing growing the population. You add into the fact, too, that the share of people retired is in the process of doubling. You are going to have possibly a declining workforce within the next decade. Well, even if workforce is zero, that leaves productivity that's been growing at about 1.6%. So if you want to get to the 3.5% growth that these Republicans keep promising me, you're going to need to double productivity permanently or do something about the labor force. What you can't start doing is deporting people, completely getting rid of immigration. You're never going to grow 3% with a stagnant workforce, and that's the danger. We may not have a recession, but you're piling on tariffs to a low labor force growth economy, which is going to lower capital investment. It's going to affect labor productivity. We could kind of settle into a period of 1%, 1.5% economic growth for a while, which when you look at the economic challenges we face, the demographic challenges we face, the economic term for that is bad.
And can I add one thing to what Jessica said? Going back to the 3% projection, empirically, over the last 2 years, our average growth rate has been roughly 3%. So we know that 3% growth is not enough to solve this problem. And as a matter of fact, if you go back 2 years ago and you compare how we overperformed how CBO thought we would grow over 2023 and 2024, it's roughly equal between labor force growth and productivity growth. So we had like a very healthy mix of overperformance in both areas. And that was clearly still not enough to solve the problem for us. Sorry.
So we only have a few minutes left. I have about 8 more questions that I want to ask all of you. This has been, I don't want to say fun, but very lively. We'll have to do it again.
Yeah.
We got a question from Zoom, and I'm gonna ask the question, then I'm gonna adjust the question. The question is, what are the best politically feasible ways, right, with full respect to the questioner, we're so sorry, to raise revenue to cut the deficit without overly burdening the bottom half of the income distribution and hurting GDP? I think politically feasible is hard, and that's part of what we've all been talking about here. But I'm wondering if just sort of rapid fire, if each of you could talk about if you were Augustus, how you would handle this problem.
Maybe broadly interpreting politically feasible to include like what you would hope people with different views. So I think that just two broad points. One, I would try to keep in mind the kind of pro-growth tax reforms. I think there are a number of reforms you can make to the tax code that wouldn't negatively impact economic performance. I would, particularly look at things like enforcement, which we have really underinvested in. I also think that, some of the evidence from the 2017 tax laws that there were pieces that were quite stimulative. Again, we talked about things like bonus depreciation. It's much less clear the degree to which an across the board rate cut on the corporate side was kind of largely contributed to economic growth. And so I would look seriously there. I'd also look at, ways you could, deal with some of the loopholes that allow people to the wealthiest households to never pay tax on large appreciated earnings. And then I don't want to just say I don't want to just say revenue things very quickly. I think that, you do need to look in Medicare and Medicaid at ways that there are several just completely ridiculous policies related to billing that create incentives for providers to do all kinds of wacky things that just drive up billing versus actually, improve care and improve health quality.
Completely agree on all of that. I would, on the corporate side, I would, on the one hand, exempt more investment from taxation. But then, maybe pare back some of the corporate tax cuts that we've had recently, so that, that would hold investment harmless. Once you do that, you worry less about the economic impact on the corporate side. I would look at inheritance taxes and raising those. Obviously, there's a segment of the population that would not like that, but I think broadly speaking, that would be politically feasible for most people. I'm guessing a VAT would not be politically feasible, so I'm not going to mention
Carbon tax.
Yeah, carbon.
That
Yes,
carbon tax.
carbon tax without a refund. Yeah, that's
Well, last June, I released a comprehensive budget plan to avert a debt crisis, available online for free download. 43-page plan to stabilize the 30-year debt, fully scored by outside experts such as the Tax Policy Center. You were not available, apparently. It does not balance the budget. It stabilizes the debt in a somewhat bipartisan way, I hope, by putting everything on the table. But the reality is, most of the savings come from Social Security and Medicare, because that's where most of the problem is. And just to put a number on that, this year, Social Security and Medicare will run a cash deficit of $500 billion. A decade from now, they'll run a cash deficit of $2.4 trillion. Probably have to address that. The way I address Social Security and Medicare is mostly by trimming benefits for higher incomes. Protect the bottom half, but a lot of rich seniors aren't going to make as big of a killing in Social Security and Medicare. I also raise taxes on the rich, get rid of the 20% pass-through deduction, raise the top rate back up to 39.6, raise the Medicare tax 1 point, and gradually reduce the healthcare exclusion. There's a lot there. It's 43 pages. I can't summarize. Google it.
Well, Jessica said that her download was free. I'm going to balance the federal budget by charging for Jessica's download, which I think will solve the problem. I want to thank everyone in the room so much for coming. I want to thank everyone on the Zoom so much for taking time out over their lunch. I hope your desk salad was delicious. And I want to particularly thank our panelists for coming up to New Haven and having this conversation with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.